Dr. Bair is a graduate of the University of Wisconsin. Jack, you can note that from Stevens Point. He received his doctorate in psychology from Northwestern University in 1991 as a counseling psychologist. Dr. Bair has been employed for 16 years at Evanston Hospital and was group coordinator in the outpatient psychiatry program. He's worked at Hines VA Hospital and Great Lakes Navy Hospital. He has a long biography of which I'm not going to read you the whole thing, but he's currently an associate clinical professor at Rosalind Franklin University of Medicine and Science. He has taught for 28 years, and he continues to supervise students and staff as a leader at the Level Trauma Research Lab. Dr. Bair has numerous professional presentations and publications. His primary topics include trauma and research, traumatic brain injury, as well as PTSD. I wish to welcome Dr. Bair. Please come. Donald, he's been educated by the Jesuits. He was a colonel in the U.S. Marine Corps, and he is going to be one of the additional presenters for this morning's presentation. Colonel O'Donnell.
So let me say again that we are so impressed and so pleased and privileged to be here. This is not your typical group. There's so much talent and wisdom here. And our goal today is to present some science, present some clinical work, and really go a little deeper into PTSD and moral injury than you may be familiar with. But our primary goal is to engage with you. So we're going to allow plenty of time for response, questions, and really, we don't know whether we're going to go more in a scientific direction or more in a clinical direction. Let's hear first, how many veterans are in the group here? Would you please stand? Thank you. And how many people here have veterans in their family? Yeah. The truth is, all of us have veterans in our families, but if you have veterans that are close in your family, you're going to know this topic. And while we're talking about veterans with our primary research area, this is relevant to lots of populations. And we're getting into new areas of understanding suffering. And it's about time, and I'm very committed to this topic. When I was young in Evanston Hospital, we had a fire in Rust-Oleum paint fire. Anybody remember the Rust-Oleum paint fire? It was pretty ugly. If you remember, and paint fires are very dangerous because they got huge tanks that can blow up. And so the courageous fire people were running hoses in and out, and the fire was vicious. I actually was in a number of vicious fires and other situations, so I started early getting exposed to PTSD. But here we are in the emergency room at Evanston Hospital, top hospital. Man comes in from the fire, and he's one of the lieutenants, and all he can talk about is Vietnam, and it's flooded. He's lost in intrusive thoughts and memories. And the psychiatrist who was with me, we at that time, this is 1978, we were still operating from Diagnostic and Statistical Manual 2. Do we have mental health people here? Mental health? Yeah, if you know DSM now, it's more than 1,000 pages, and it's extremely detailed with over 300 diagnoses. Nobody knew what PTSD was or how to respond. But everybody was somewhat familiar with PTSD because trauma has been around forever. But to show you the ineptitude of a major hospital, here we were responding to this vet. and we didn't know it was combat PTSD. What the rule outs were, was it LSD? Why is he having flashbacks? Has he had head injury? At that time, it shows how minimalist was our knowledge of trauma. Even though historically, all of us have read in histories from Civil War and World War I and II and all wars. In those days, it was called soldier's heart. People came back from war and had great difficulty. In World War II, it was it was shell shock. And some of you remember that one of our very famous generals was photographed interviewing a vet who was really having a PTSD reaction. And he took his gloves and slapped him and insulted him. And that was the level of our knowledge of PTSD. And so it's so important. And we're going to have to talk about some suicide, and we're going to have to talk about some ugly situations, but we won't talk too much about it. But we can't get to moral injury if we don't talk about ugly. So let me just say that we're so honored to have many of our colleagues and friends here, but Major General James Mukiyama has been my colleague for over 15 years. He's published on moral injury and PTSD, and he and I have spoken at hospitals. We've spoken down at the Pritzker Military Museum, and he's here today, and he is the founder of this organization. And I put it up here because the imagery we like. I wish I could get General Mukiyama, would you tell us the motto? Didn't quite fit the.
Yeah, when you can't walk, you crawl, and when you can't walk, you crawl, and when you can't crawl, we will carry you. And that is a motto of Military Outreach USA. We're a 501c3 nonprofit. We're faith-based, and we're here to help veterans and their families. The families sacrifice and serve as much as the service members.
Yeah. So it's a tremendous organization that does so much for veterans in many states. But for us, in our research, they have been funders of some of our research and our student presentations, as has Rotary. But I wanted to be sure to recognize General Mukiyama's work, and hopefully we'll hear from him in the discussion. How many of you know PTSD personally or in your family? Yeah, probably more of you do than you can quite acknowledge. How many of you know moral injury in your personal life or your family? Probably that's much more around than you know. Maybe you haven't seen it, or maybe it's just too difficult to talk about. How many have suicides in their family or know about suicide? The likelihood is you know moral injury if you know anybody who's suicided. What we're finding, which is inspiring all of us to be here today and to do this research work and this clinical work, is that the people who end up killing themselves so often, we always thought it was depression, but it's not just depression. It is depression oftentimes, it's primary, but the condemnation that comes with moral injury is so prevalent. And when we were young soldiers, clinicians, we didn't know that. And it's only when you've been in the field and you've seen people take themselves out or have other people take them out. You know, suicide is not just what you do to yourself. What I learned when I was at Evanston Hospital was you have occasional suicides, inpatient, outpatient. But when I went to the government and worked with the VA, suicide is just what you hear in the media. You know, 20, 22 a day. And you see it and you feel it. I was there for 2 weeks and one vet jumped in front of a car. He didn't kill himself, but the woman who was driving was put in a state of panic and shock. But over the years, there were suicides from stepping in front of trains, hangings, shootings, overdoses. So many ways to kill yourself. Neglect, And you'll hear some more about neglect. But another way that people kill themselves is by suicide by cop. Have you known anybody who's been in that situation? Some years ago, a young vet was going to go into our residential program and he asked me, "Doc, can I see you as soon as I get out?" And I said, "Of course, I'm looking forward to it." That weekend, he went home, went to the motel, took a toy gun, pretended, this is the Gulf War. And he pretends to stick up the person at the desk. They call the police come, he holds out a toy gun and they shoot him. That's not as uncommon as it sounds. And even more common are those people who are involved in addiction. And you may not know this, but I know this, that some of those people who disappear with addiction are not overdosing themselves. They say to their friend, "Can you give me some more? Can you give me some more?" Whether it's cocaine or heroin. And sadly, they're gone. And then their friend is left with the survivor guilt as well as the suicide happening in the family. So suicide is quite common in veterans. And it's that work, I was a director of the dual diagnosis program, brought me face to face with a lot of suicides. And then I got it. And several of my colleagues got it. Is Dr. Gard here today? Dr. Sumner Gard. What an honor. This man hired me back in 1991, and he's an artist and a vet. And he said to me when he hired me, you said to me, "We want you to do research." Today, I'll show you some of the results of your asking us to do this. So at that time, though, the response to suicide was people didn't know what to do. They didn't know that you should post-mortem or have a review session for every suicide. And the more you do that, the more you hear and you realize that underneath those suicides is the self-condemnation that comes from moral injury. And PTSD, this was a big deal to come in 1983. You heard what happened in 1978. We didn't know what to do with the guy in the emergency room. Later on, he went through our residential program and outpatient therapy up at North Chicago VA, now the Federal Health Center. But at that time, we didn't know. In 1980, we start to understand that PTSD, it's been around forever. Freud called it repetition compulsion, but they didn't get it, that it's a response to trauma. Now today, we're here to tell you that we've gone way beyond DSM-2 and we're going to go beyond DSM-5 and 6 and 7 to, at this time, moral injury is not included in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual because it's a little political. It's a little difficult to understand. 35, 40 years ago, it was homosexuality was in the DSM. Now we got to face the fact that moral injury is indeed a unique and profound, troubling subset of PTSD or connection with PTSD. It's in the trauma spectrum. Moral injury is those people who do the things, or either they're perpetrators or victims, or they witness. And if you work with combat vets back from the military, you know it's much more common than you can believe. One of my earlier cases was a wonderful man back from World War II. And he was getting older and he wanted to tell me about what happened in the islands. And he just shuddered and shook and cried. And finally he told me we executed them. We don't think that we do that. But what happens when you have prisoners that are in the way and you're fighting a battle? You know what? They can have access to turn on you. So this happens in war throughout history. And he just cried and cried. But in his latter year or two, he and his wife came in and he was so relieved that finally he was able to say that, his family was from the Holocaust. He said, and that's what we were doing. And he went on to detail those kinds of situations. Clear moral injury, clear shame and guilt and humiliation, and finally able to deal with it. Fortunately, he had family support that helped him get there. Other examples of moral injury, the Desert War or Bosnia, the way that people so often would get killed in recent wars are roadside bombs. And you know how roadside bombs are triggered? Cell phones. Now, what happens if you're a young combat vet and you're whatever kind of equipment you're trafficking down the road and you see a young man or a young woman with a cell phone? What do? You know what you do? When you've smelled the burning flesh of your comrades, you know, you take them out. You know, not always, but that is. And then what happens when you've taken out people who pull out a cell phone? Some of them are kids that are calling their mom. War is ugly. And there's so many examples, from torture to throwing grenades and hooches and seeing who you kill, or even if you're in artillery, you know, and you see pictures of what you've done with your artillery. And, you know, you don't think it bothers you any more than we don't think so much about people that are sending drones. But watch what happens. You can send drones, and yeah, you have distance, but you will in your lifetime see pictures of and know what you did with those drones, like snipers. So moral injury comes back to haunt people. The judgment, the self-condemnation. So, but let's not talk too much about that. Let's talk about how we're researching it and why is it important to research PTSD and moral injury? Because we've seen too much death. We see too much suffering. We know something more about it now than we did. I want all my students, the young ones, when the next DSM comes out, I want them and their studies to be part of the change where we can write about moral injury and what it does to exacerbate suffering. So we're going to talk about moral compass. And Colonel O'Donnell is going to tell some stories about moral compass. But one of this study, actually right here, is about moral resilience and how moral resilience is formed and how that helps to minimize moral injury. This study is about themes of underlying moral injury in a number of vets. And it's quite, I can talk more about the studies, but we want to get first through moral code, moral compass, moral development. So I'd like to ask you just a very quick experiential. If you can see this little chart, you see the dividing line. To be human, if we're lucky, we've had some very moral, inspirational leadership from coaches or parents or scouts or wherever it came from, music. I'd like you to just see if you can think about 3 or 4 mentors or situations that were morally inspirational for you. And then I'd like you to consider morally painful experiences. Much harder to envision. We don't like shame. The bottom line of moral injury is that shame keeps us from doing review, reflection. It keeps us from knowing ourselves. In our time, our kids' times, we're going to move the clock forward and being able to talk about shame. If you have addiction, if you have moral injury, so often they go together. We need to be able to open that discussion up, and you hear that happening more and more in the political discussion about how we need to understand the drug crisis. But if you can just imagine in your own life, and then if you can think about some of the folks who have had extreme morally painful experiences, and they haven't had moral mentors. So we're blessed and fortunate. We know that everybody in here could readily name some people in some situations that have been inspirational for them. Thank you. Colonel O'Donnell, will you step forward and talk some about moral development?
Am I live? Thank you for being here. I have some things I want to relate to you. I'll tell you some stories. I want to give you a little background, just to give you some idea. There's about 21 million veterans in the country. Where are they located? California has the largest amount, about 1.5 million. Texas has about 1.4 million. Pennsylvania has 700. In Chicago area and throughout Illinois, we probably have anywhere from 3. The reason, is it working?
Yeah.
Okay. The reason I'm loose with the numbers, because I don't believe them. And the reason I don't believe them is because almost every week we're uncovering more and more individuals who are in the military. They're now in some sort of medical condition and they're not registered. But we have to get them onto this. So the stories I'm going to tell you are emanated from my experience working with Dr. Bair up at Lovell Hospital. He's the one that got me into this business to begin with. I was up there sitting in one of the PTSD sessions, and he said to me, Chris, you ought to get involved with this committee. And I said, what's it do? He says, I don't know, but just get involved with it. So I ended up working for Jim Mukayama now. So you guys are responsible for me. Let me share some stories with you. First of all, Lovell Hospital is one of 3 VA hospitals in the area. Lovell's up in North Chicago, Hines is out in Maywood, and Jesse Brown is downtown. They're all perfectly, they offer terrific services. I've had more experience with Jesse Brown because I volunteered there. And most recently with Lovell, I've been participating with, I'm a chairman of a committee or co-chairman of a committee called the Patient Family Advocate Committee. But let me share some stories with you. And I picked this, the method for stories is because you think about where have you learned in your lifetime and what's the most popular book in the world? The answer is the Bible, right? And the Bible is a series of stories. So I like to use that as an avenue. And I also like to open up with the concept that we read that Bible, there are stories in there, and the one aspect that hit me really hard, we were reading, I'm in a Bible study group. I think I see some of the guys here from Bible study. And it was the passage from James. If you go to James chapter 1, verse 19, it says, it depends on which Bible you're reading, but this is the kind of language. It says, quickly, listen, slow to talk, slow to wrath. So what I've learned in the process of working with Dr. Bair and working with who call me quite listen. And the term that I use is, tell me about that. So the first story I want to relate to you has been quite impactful for me. I'm sitting in one of the PTSD sessions with Dr. Bair. There's a fellow sitting next to me. His name is John. And so I got to know him. I go and I sit down and I always talk to John. So John says to me, Chris, you got to go down to the Dempster Vets and get involved there. So I don't know about Dempster Vets. So he said, no, come down, sit with me. So I go down. I go down to Dempster, which is on Waukegan and Dempster. There's a Dunkin' Donuts there. And every Tuesday morning, like this morning, we'd have 110 veterans in the room. So I would go down to this meeting and I would sit with John. But I got to know him. Then before you know it, I got to know many of the other veterans. So over about a year or so ago, maybe a year and a half ago, I said to Carlos, who was one of the fellows leading that group, I said, where is John? He said, you know what? We haven't seen him. I said, we'll figure that out. So I said, whatever we do, we'll call up to Lovell and alert the ER up there that we're going to bring this fellow up if there's need for that, et cetera. Fine. So 4 fellows go over, okay? And I can name their names, 3 Marines and 3 Marines and 1 Army fellow. So they go to the door and Carlos knocks on the door. He says, John, open up. Carlos. No answer. Knock. Finally, John comes to the door. He's about as big as a minute. He probably weighed maybe 60 pounds, 70 pounds. He had lost a lot of weight. And he had a roll of money in his hand. So he says, I don't need this. We don't want your bloody. We don't want your money. Why don't you come down? We'll take you to Cappy's and we'll get you some breakfast. So they go to breakfast, and what they find is John is eating everybody's breakfast. He hadn't been eating. And the next day they went back to the house. They thought we better double check on him. So they went back to the house, and they go into the house. It's really, it's not inhabitable, okay? And I remember also talking with John when I was in these meetings. He would talk about the weapons that he had in his basement. And I'd say to him, John, you got to take those firing pins out of those weapons. He said, oh, it's okay. No, don't worry about it. I said, no, I feel safe with you and your weapons, but if Joe Schmo comes in this house and steals those weapons, you're culpable and you got to be careful. Oh, don't worry. I'm worried about that. So anyway, they went back to the house. They said, John, we talked to Chris O'Donnell, and he thinks that you've been meeting your appointments up at Lovell. Oh, yeah, maybe I have. Of course, he's missing everything because he can't get around. And he ends up, they get in the car, they call in advance to the emergency department and alerted them. He goes in, diagnosed with dementia, doesn't know where he is. He's lost, he was really in very, very bad shape. So he was in intensive care for probably 3 weeks or so, and then they put him someplace else. So anyway, I called up and I said, what's going to happen to John? Because he was really 100% disabled because of PTSD. And they said, well, we need to get a petitioner. I said, well, what do you have to do to be a petitioner? Well, you have to have a petitioner to get you have to petition a lawyer to get a guardian, and the guardian then takes charge. We move from there. So I called back about 3 or 4 days later, have you found a petitioner? No, we haven't got it. I said, I'll do it. I'll write the memo. Because John had asked me to do a financial plan for him. My background was such that I could do that. And so I knew more about John than John knew about himself. His 3 cars and where the house was and all that sort of thing. So anyway, I wrote this long memo and I sent it to the social worker up at Lovell. And I said, whatever you got to do it, but let's get going. We can't just leave him in limbo here. So they went up, they finally got, they went to a judge, they used my memo as a petitioner, even though I'm not licensed to do that. But I have all of the information that they needed. They ended up getting a judge to appoint a guardian, and so John is now at Lovell and doing well. And every time I go up there, I go and see John, okay? So that's a story where I was really impacted by meeting John and getting involved. The next story I want to talk about, it goes back to this issue about James 1:19. I'm getting phone calls regularly, as my wife Pat will confirm. I get them I get 3 or 4 calls a week. And I look at my opportunity here to kind of short circuit people who are considering suicide. But the one story that really comes to mind, which was very momentous for me. So I get a call from Roger. Hi, this is Chris and I said, I'm Roger. He said, I was referred to you. I talked to Roger McGill and these other guys. They said, call Chris. I'm here. What can I do for you? Well, you know, so he goes on. I talked to Roger for maybe 45 minutes to an hour. And I said to him to begin with, well, tell me about this. He said to me, I got to file for bankruptcy. I said, well, tell me what's going on. Well, the long and the short was it. He's 77 years of age, was in the Army for 10 years. He has 4 older sisters, 3 are married and 3 have children. He's supporting those kids and their education. His mother, he's been supporting the mother in a nursing home for the last 10 years. This guy's short on money. He's taking care of everybody else except for himself. So I said, after listening to this long story, and while he's describing this, I'm basically asking him, what's this and what's that? And in my mind, I'm building a balance sheet, an income statement, a cash flow statement, and a cash budget. So I'm able to do that. So I got a pretty good idea what's going on. So I said, okay, Roger, let's do this. I got some things for you to do. Number 1, I want you to go and pay off the smallest debt that you have. $100, $400, whatever, the smallest one, get rid of that. Number 2, I want you to write down everything that you and I have talked about. You've told me things. I want you to write it down. So it's focus in your mind. Number 3, I want you to call the 2 largest creditors that you have, because he owed $60,000 to Chase and $40,000 to Discover. And I said, I want you to use this story, but use an elevator discussion. Don't stretch it out, just make it an elevator, right? And the issue is, you're going to tell them you're 77 years of age, you've been supporting your mother in a nursing home for the last 10 years, and all these other things. And these creditors are coming at them. But keep it short and sweet. And I want you to say to them, and I intend to pay back. Use those words. I intend to pay back. And then what I'm going to do in 2 weeks, I'm going to call you back. He said, okay. So 2 weeks go by and I call and I say, hey, Rogers, Chris, oh gosh, I'll tell you. So what has happened? He did all of the items that I suggested. He said to me, you know, I've sold my condo and moved in with a friend. So I got rid of it. He had a mortgage on the condo. He ended up, he paid off the first loan. And the reason I want him to pay off the first loan in my mind is I wanted him to have a sense that he's in control. These other guys are sending him mail all day long, and want him to get a sense that he's in control of something. And the next part came up, which I figured was going to be an enlightening experience. In the case of Discover, they reduced the loan to half. They said, we'll have it paid off in 10 years. And I thought, that's not what I'm looking for. In the case of Chase, they said they forgave the whole thing. That story was really impactful for me. And it was a circumstance where I used that old adage that we find in James 1:19, and that is, listen, just listen. Because in essence, as he described this to me, I was able to kind of put together what's going on.
It's playing off.
Talking
When it turns one way,
One off, turn the one off. Sorry about that. Have you heard that?
it's down too low.
So talk right into that one.
Let me look at my notes here for a minute. Okay, can you hear me?
Yep.
So the last story, the story that pertains to veterans, what I'm seeing, and maybe Jim, this will give you some insight what we're experiencing. Roger McGill and I have been getting phone calls from wives. So the senior members of the military who are at home or in nursing homes, et cetera, the wives are dealing with these circumstances. And I'll tell you, the first circumstance I got involved in was a couple of weeks back. This gal Sharon calls me and she says, "Oh, you gotta help me. I don't know what to do. My husband's in this circumstance. He's in a nursing home. They're not taking good care of him. They don't change the sheets and on and on and on." And I said, "Tell me about all that." So I kept notes and trying to keep track. Well, it turns out she is a caregiver. Okay, so Level and these other hospitals have a capacity to offer caregiver assistance. But the end result was she related to me that she and her husband had paid $14,000 to a lawyer someplace in the country to help him get benefits from the VA. And I thought, wow, we should have gotten involved here before this, because there are mechanisms that we put in place. I put them in touch with the folks up at Level, and the more enlightening experience to this was, one of the fellows in the group at Niles found out that I was involved. He said, "I'll work on that." So I gave him the number. So he has been driving John to medical and taking care of Karen or Sharon to get groceries, etc. So I'm finding I got a lot of support within the group. It's pretty impressive. The last story I want to tell you is a fellow goes to his doctor. And he signs up and he says to the doctor, he says, I'm having a hard time because I got ghosts living under my bed at nighttime. I'm scared to go to bed. Doctor says, "Oh, tell me more about that." So they're talking. The end result is the doctor said, "Well, let's do this. You can come to me a couple times a week and we'll keep track and I'll walk you through whatever you're going through. He said, well, let me think about that. Well, let me ask you this. How much does it cost me for each time I go? He said, $150. He said, well, let me think about that. So about 6 months go by and the doctor hasn't seen him. So they meet each other in a community center like this, and they ran into each other. So the doctor says, whatever happened? You didn't come back. He said, no, I fixed it. It cost me $10 to fix it. He said, well, what did you do? Well, I'm okay. In fact, I feel so good. I went and bought myself a truck. It's what happened. Because you were going to charge me $150 each visit, which was going to cost me, thousands of dollars. But I went to the bar and I talked to the bartender and I told him the story. And the bartender said, I said, what do I want to do? He said, it's easy. Just cut off the legs on the bed. And the answer many times is, if I want to. Thank you very much.
Let's see. Thank you, Colonel O'Donnell. How's the sound? Okay, we need to move along because we want to hear from you, but let me just cover. You're a sophisticated audience. You know about moral development. You know about importance of structure. A lot of people don't get the right structure. And so moral foundations minimize PTSD and minimize moral injury. Nothing can minimize traumatic brain injury, which we haven't mentioned, but moral injury, PTSD, and traumatic brain injury so often overlap. It's really a transdiagnostic, and for years people have had TBI and no one has known it because it's low level. We're used to seeing traumatic brain injury at a high level, but the low level TBI is very sad. So let me just go. I want to do the academic and the recognition of our students, our faculty, and say that Dr. Sumner-Gart, these are recent studies. Our early studies, by the way, back at Northwestern and so on, were more on social and preconscious. And preconscious means that our brain and our consciousness is really, as we know, very active, more than we before we cognate and think. Our brain is doing all kinds of operations. So we went from social and leadership measurement now to looking at PTSD and TBI and moral injury. And I just want to mention Captain Cassandra Shimpsa did one of these early studies with us. And we're very proud that we have psychology and psychiatry who are also military. Lieutenant Hostetler with the Navy, she did assessing moral injury and PTSD. Kate Long assisted me in writing a chapter which really led to this research, the evolving diagnosis of PTSD, where we realized it's further than the basic fear conditioning. When we think about PTSD from the movies and so on, and the DSM, typically it's the back of your brain, it's the hippocampus. You can track the neural pathways from PTSD. But for moral injury, we haven't investigated it. It's only in the last couple of years where we're starting to understand that shame can affect the brain differently than fear. And if you do mice, some of our colleagues up at the medical school do, they can induce PTSD with mice. Simply turn the lights up, make noise. Sometimes you can have a rattle in the cage, and the mice become PTSD patients. You can do it with monkeys, they do it, but the way you can cure them is a little neuropeptide Y or a little oxytocin. Well, it's possible that if we learn the neural pathways and the brain operations of shame, we're going to be much more able to deal with it. But as you know, shame is so unspeakable and it's central to moral injury. Dan Perez from the Gulf War, Sergeant Jacques Bair, these are all part of our team currently, but they've all published. This one's published, this one's submitted, that one is being revised for publication. But these are studies we've done. And I'm just so proud that we have had the support of the government, of the medical school, and the military outreach and Rotary. and being able to do these studies. But now we're going forward to do eye tracking. Why are we doing eye tracking? Because I got a grant. Why did I get a grant? Because I convinced people that we need to look at the neural pathways for PTSD and TBI and moral injury. So these are our studies. Want to get right up here to eye tracking. So we got this little operation only cost $35,000 plus the software. And this is what we're using for our current study that's going before IRB any day now. We have done already a few eye tracking studies, but you don't know this, but fear conditioned PTSD happens all the time. You all have a little bit of it from wherever it came from. But if you've been shot at, your brain knows what it's like to be shot at and doesn't want to be there. So that if, go to the next slide. So that if many of us look at this beach or look at that rocky cairn in small town, we might think, oh, I wonder, where we can do our snorkeling. If you've been shot at, if you've been sniped at, your brain will go in less than 3 seconds, in the 2.5 seconds, your eyes will have scanned the site of potential attack. And it's also true if you've been assaulted, if you've been raped, if you've been, the brain records and is very tuned into fear conditioning. What we're looking at now is moral injury conditioning. And this study we've done a couple studies, but the next one is the one that we're very excited. We show pictures of situations that are morally untenable or suggestive of this for vets. And what happens is we're going to look at their eye tracking and we're going to see if we can, that are shameful, evocative pictures. There's a whole, by the way, a library. This is a great data bank that a lot of people do research from internationally, but they get these pictures and you can get all kinds of categories. So then in a matter of 15 or 20 seconds of sitting and looking at a picture and having the computer put different pictures in, you can track where the eyes have gone. And there's called saccades, but it's really the eyes, both where they go and how they get there, and the number of blinking and so on. All of that can be computed by an algorithm to show fear. And now we're going to see if we can differentiate between fear conditioning and shame conditioning. So that's our current research. And rather than talk too much about therapy, because we want to hear from you, these are common sense. But there's a lot of psychotherapies that work. The main thing is getting people to come to the VA or come to some psychotherapy. So many people, the biggest part of PTSD is avoidance, because it's too hard. The brain doesn't want to reprocess. It wants to reprocess, but and especially moral injury, it's shame protected. We often have vets join us. There were vets who were going to join us, but we decided not to have vets here because we've got vets in the audience. And so that is our PowerPoint. And now, Colonel O'Donnell, how do we engage the audience?
Tell me about the.
Oh. Yeah, there you go.
Dr. Card?
Hey, John.
Am I on? Still
Good to
working
see
on?
you again.
Yeah, a question on the back. Thank you.
I have a question about this the area of morality. This is something that happened after my time, so I'm not familiar with it. Did any of your research indicate a qualitative and quantitative difference between Vietnam veterans with PTSD and other forms of PTSD? Vis-a-vis the morality of the war, society's response to the veterans when they came back, et cetera.
That's a very big literature, but like other things, there are protective factors. even in World War II, you knew who the enemy was. In Vietnam, you didn't know who the enemy was. Could have been your Chu Hoi who was spying for you. Could be, the danger is everywhere. And one of the things vets often keep lots of arms in their basement because they know. Okay. So you're probably aware that protective factors protect, but a lot of, depending on the war and the situation, there were less protective factors in Vietnam. You weren't welcomed home. There was no front. In World War II, there were fronts, and yeah, there was awful PTSD. But you had, except at Dunkirk, you often had backup. So those are some of the studies that show that we know that PTSD is a little different from war to war. The basic dynamics of what the neuropsych patterns are the same, but the stimuli that is most provocative is a little different if you have safety. So if you can come back and get a meal, you're doing pretty well. And if you're in the Air Force, maybe you can even find some civilization when you come back to your barracks. But if there's not safety, you're much more vulnerable. Other questions?
I have a question that relates to our own experiences that we might have here at the center. If we run into someone that isn't
To turn your like lapel, Michael. We only have 3 chapters.
let's try this one. This one is working. I think we're okay with this one. If we run into someone that's not a family member, so I mean, if it was my father, my son, I would call a doctor. What action might we take as a concerned friend? Is there a question that we can have? And if I could impose on expanding this question to say, might PTSD go beyond military service into individuals, and what might we consider being? We know of abusive parents, we know of abusive children that have been abused by their parents, spousal abuse. So it's a 2-part question, and I'm sorry to impose you on that, but how do we look for help for someone that is not part of our family, and what can we look for in PTSD beyond the military?
I have a very good solution for you. I've been working with veterans now for 12 years. I was a veteran for over 20 years, active duty and reserves. And I don't think there's any replacement. The name of the game is to get the veteran to talk. That's the first line of defense. And so I tell many people who elect to do so, you see Jim Mukayama here, he has his military cap on. And I would say to all of you, when you meet somebody who has a military cap on, say to them, tell me about that cap. Don't say, welcome home. What am I going to say? I did it, I do it again. But if I say to Jim, tell me about that cap, and it gives him permission to pick the part that he wants to talk about. So I think you and I, when we see somebody, it goes back to listening and get the veteran to talk, because they do want to talk. And the reason I know this, because I go every Tuesday morning to this meeting and I walk in the room and they're all talking to each other. And the reason they're doing it is because they're right at home, they're in a safe environment, and they want to tell you, and I want to hear what you have to say. It's the biggest mechanism that we have. And I say the other thing is, when you're talking to somebody, look at them. Look at them in the eye and listen to what they're saying. I don't do that as well as I should. My wife will confirm that regularly. However, it's something that I've learned that I think we have to do, and it's practical. These veterans want to tell their story, and they're looking for an avenue to do so. And I think that I'm trying to address your question is what's the first, second, third steps. look them in the eye and say, "Oh, about that hat." Magic.
You mentioned a group of veterans that get together at Dunkin' Donuts. Are all people who are veterans encouraged to go? How do they get involved in it? Is it open to other veterans if they're just hearing about it for the first time right now?
Thank you. Chris will respond to that, but I want to say it's connections too. It's first talking, but connections. We do so much, and Colonel O'Donnell and General Mukiyama do so much with external veteran groups. Connect a vet. We do it right here, right in this senior center. We did it this morning. You can see the bonding, and we know we connect with other people. So those two things, one is somehow engage and then connect. By the way, the other populations, if you've heard of Erica's Lighthouse, if you know the suicide rate among high school kids, young adolescents, is slowly climbing, now higher climbing, in girls more than boys. It's really up. In Erica's Lighthouse, 2,500 schools in this country, 21 countries abroad, but they're doing the same thing we're trying to do with vets, connect the kids. They have clubs. Get the kids talking about things that they wouldn't talk about, like depression, and they don't feel good about life. But you're the expert on this particular group.
Thanks for the question. I think anecdotally, I explained that this guy, John, had said, "Come on, Chris, join me at Dunkin' Donuts." I said, "I don't know anybody. I don't even go down. I'm just a guy." So I showed up and I sat next to John. Well, it turns out 3 meetings later, I knew everybody in the room. And the reason is they all want to talk. So you're welcome to come. If you're a veteran, come. I don't run that particular program. A fellow by the name of Roger McGill and this guy, Carlos, I don't know Carlos's last name. So they pretty well run it. And what's interesting, people have said to me, "Why do you go to that?" I said, "You know what? I go there. I have nothing in common with any of them. With my background, I'm not from around Chicago. I have nothing there. I was in aviation, they're on the ground." The answer is, I have everything in common with them because we're on active duty and I know all the mishmash and the nonsense that we went through and all of the good stuff and the bad stuff. But they all have discipline. I like discipline. I'm worked on discipline. Pat will confirm that or could deny it one way or the other. Sometimes I'm not disciplined. Taking the garbage out, maybe I can do that. So I thought you'd never ask. So it's Tuesday morning, 9 to 10. It's in the Dunkin' Donuts store that would be on Dempster, just west of Waukegan on the south side. So it's in the first block there. It's a big facility. And you'll walk in and you will know nobody. You will know nobody. By the time you walk out, you'll know 2 or 3 and you'll want to come back. And the reason is they all want to say, "Tell me about it. What about you?" And interestingly, when the person who shows up for the first time, Roger McGill will say, "Okay, introduce yourself, where are you stationed, and what did you do," and all that sort of thing. And it's always different, right? Somebody's in the cab, somebody's in the Coast Guard, somebody's in the Navy aboard ship, and whatever they were. But I think the answer is that they're all accepting and willing to take on other vets. So if you have vets here and you want to get involved, and you don't have to do anything, just go down there. It's an absolute hoot. That's the best way to describe it. It's a hoot.
Can I ask a question? The DSM, that's the Bible of
Yeah.
Psychiatry, is that correct?
Diagnostics, yeah.
Yeah, I read an article that I completely did not understand. It said that basically with DSM-3, that's where PTSD first came in.
1980 and 1983.
Okay, the article I read says in recent years, they came out with 4 and 5 on PTSD. That's
Yes.
correct? And those 2 included, backtracking, 3 PTSD was solely military. PTSD equaled military. 4 and 5 includes other groups, civilians.
Yes.
That are seen there. The article I read, they were violently against this change in PSD. They were saying it should be only military. The civilians don't get PTSD. And I didn't understand anything. Could you enlighten me on this?
Well, I think we all know something about different views of reality. And one of the reasons that I write and research is because I've been around a lot of theory. You know, theories are okay, but I want to see what you've got to back up your theory. So the DSM, it's evolving. Mental health is evolving. Civilization, we hope, is evolving, although sometimes it goes the wrong way. De-evolving, evolving. So that's what I can say is that watch and see. Okay, but I do want to say this. If you need to know a vet who needs to connect, Mr. Connector, connect a vet. So you find out, people like myself, General Mukiyama, we have a lot of vet therapy types. We know how to invite vets. Doesn't mean they come right away. Ron knows how to invite vets. The Glenview Marines know how to connect with vets. So there are people around. Look for us and we'll be there.
I'll address the issue about having to be on active duty or in the military. I'll explain a circumstance that we're dealing with right now at up at level. So when there has to be a certain rank of an individual in the military who's going to go deliver the news to the parents that their child has been killed, and so they're Gold Star families. And the sentence is that it's very regimented as to what's the rank, what do you do, how do you behave, what do you say, do you go in the door, do you have somebody come with you? It's really quite structured. But the word has something like this. The President of the United States has authorized me to come and express his sympathy for the loss of your son who died on April the 1st and such a spot at these coordinates and et cetera. Okay. So we're dealing with a young man right now who is a Marine. He's about 6'3". He looks the part like he should. I'm kind of puny. I weigh 158 pounds. I'm kind of puny, but I got a lot of action. So this fellow who really looks the part well. So he's performed this particular visit, okay, any number of times. How many times has he done this? Good guess. Over 300. You don't think he's covering from PTSD? This is a major issue. He's just gone to deliver the message to you that your son died in Iraq or Afghanistan or wherever they are. Right now, the Marines are in Australia. That's where the big group are. And you take that message, and now how does he absorb that, right? There's no happiness here. But that's a good example where you're not in combat, and this guy is really, we're working with him right now. It's a big deal. Thank you.
And I've had that situation, so we know it's common if two of us has work at the end. Anything in closing? We're happy to stick around and talk about our work. Also, to do what we can to advance Connect a Vet or connect people in trouble.